Darkness Falls, Part 1. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a sense of unease settled over the Fable lands. The villagers of Boren, accustomed to the familiar rhythm of day and night, found themselves enveloped in an unnerving twilight. The sky, instead of turning a deep blue, seemed to absorb the light, creating a void that swallowed the stars. Strange noises began to echo through the village. Whispers that carried no words, footsteps with no origin, and a low, haunting melody that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. The villagers, huddled in their homes, whispered tales of ancient curses and forgotten prophecies, their faces pale with fear. As the night deepened, the colors of the world began to change. Shadows danced in hues of green and blue, while the moon cast an eerie, blood-red glow over the land. The villagers saw colors they had never known existed, luminous purples, ghostly whites, and sickly yellows that shimmered in the darkness. Children cried out in their sleep, plagued by nightmares of monstrous creatures lurking in the shadows. Elders spoke of omens and portents, their voices trembling as they recounted stories from their youth, tales of a great darkness that once threatened their world. In the distance, over the rolling hills, a figure appeared, cloaked in shadows. The villagers watched in silent terror as the figure moved closer, his presence bringing an even deeper darkness. It was the warlock, a powerful sorcerer whose name was spoken only in whispers. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his staff crackled with dark energy. The warlock raised his staff high, and with a voice that seemed to shake the very earth, he began to chant. The villagers held their breath, their eyes fixed on the dark figure. Suddenly, a bright purple fireball erupted from the warlock's staff, lighting up the night with an intense, otherworldly glow. Darkness Falls, Part 2. In the heart of Boren, nestled between the rolling hills and the dense forest, lay the distiller's workshop. Known for his exquisite brews and potent liquors, the distiller was a man of science and precision, his days filled with the rhythmic bubbling of concoctions and the soothing scent of herbs. But tonight, his sanctuary was anything but soothing. As the village settled back into an uneasy calm, the distiller noticed something strange in his workshop. The usually steady, warm glow of his lantern flickered erratically, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. He brushed it off as residual effects from the warlock's fireball, but a gnawing sense of dread tugged at his mind. He moved to his workbench, intent on continuing his work, but as he reached for a flask, his hand froze. The liquid inside had turned a vivid, unnatural shade of green. He stared, bewildered, as the colors in his distillery began to shift and swirl, hues that defied nature seeping into his brews and tinctures. The copper stills and glass bottles reflected the eerie light, creating a kaleidoscope of colors that seemed to pulse and breathe with a life of their own. The air grew thick with a cloying, sweet scent that he couldn't place, and an unsettling hum filled the room, vibrating through his bones. He stepped back, heart pounding, and glanced around his workshop. Shadows moved in the corners of his vision, fleeting but unmistakable. The tools of his trade, the mortar and pestle, the alembics, the pipettes, seemed to shift and twist when he wasn't looking directly at them. The distiller's mind raced with questions and fears. Was this a lingering effect of the warlock's magic? Or something darker, more sinister? He felt a cold sweat trickle down his back as the hum grew louder, now interspersed with faint whispers that seemed to come from the very walls. Desperation mounting, he grabbed a vial of his strongest elixir, hoping to clear his head. But as he uncorked it, the liquid inside bubbled violently and changed color, turning a deep, inky black. A tendril of dark vapor rose from the vial, curling in the air like a living thing. He dropped it, the glass shattering on the floor, the vapor dissipating with a hiss. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke of secrets and shadows, of darkness that could not be dispelled. He felt them pulling at his mind, dragging him towards the unknown. The colors around him intensified, swirling faster, becoming a chaotic dance of light and shadow that threatened to overwhelm him. He staggered back, eyes wide with terror, as the room seemed to close in on him. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was a figure in the doorway. Tall, cloaked in shadows, eyes glowing with an unholy light. The warlock? Or something else, something older and more malevolent? The villagers awoke the next morning to find the distiller's workshop eerily silent. The door hung ajar, and a strange, lingering mist seeped out. Inside, the colors had returned to normal, but the sense of unease remained. The distiller was gone, vanished without a trace. Only the shattered vial and the faint, lingering whispers hinted at the horrors that had transpired. The villagers could only speculate, their imaginations running wild with possibilities. Had the distiller succumbed to the darkness? Or had he been taken by something far worse? The Fable lands were once again bathed in the light of day, but the memory of that night lingered, a chilling reminder that the darkness was never far away. And as for the distiller's fate, only the shadows knew the truth, leaving the villagers and the readers to wonder, to fear, and to imagine. Darkness Falls, Part 3. Last we heard the distiller was gone, vanished without a trace. Only the shattered vial and the faint, lingering whispers hinted at the horrors that had transpired. The villagers could only speculate, their imaginations running wild with possibilities. Had the distiller succumbed to the darkness? Or had he been taken by something far worse? As days turned into weeks, the villagers began to notice subtle changes in their environment. The once clear streams running through Boren turned murky, and the plants started to wither. A foul stench lingered in the air, and animals behaved strangely, their eyes glowing with an eerie, sickly light. One fateful night, under the cover of a moonless sky, a figure emerged from the forest. Cloaked in a tattered tunic and exuding an aura of malevolence, it was the distiller, but not as they remembered him. His eyes burned a venomous red, and his hands dripped with a noxious, oily substance. He had become the poisoner. The warlock's curse had twisted his soul and mind, transforming him into a harbinger of decay and destruction. The poisoner moved through the village silently, spreading his toxic brews, corrupting the land and its people. The villagers, paralyzed with fear, could only watch as their beloved distiller turned into their worst nightmare. The whispers in the night grew louder, more frequent. They spoke of the poisoner's plan to taint the very essence of Fable lands, turning it into a realm of perpetual darkness and despair. The villagers whispered of a hero who might rise to challenge the poisoner, but for now, they lived in constant fear, dreading the night and the strange colors that came with it. The fate of the distiller, now the poisoner, and the safety of Fable lands remained uncertain. The villagers clung to hope, praying that light would once again pierce the darkness and that the malevolent curse could be broken. Until then, they watched and waited, their imaginations running wild with the horrors yet to come. Darkness Falls, Part 4. Deep within the forest, the warlock's magic pulsated like a heartbeat, its malevolent energy seeping into the earth and sky. It was this dark power that called to an ancient and enigmatic entity, one that had slumbered for centuries, awaiting the perfect moment to awaken. Drawn by the warlock's potent spells, the creature stirred, sensing an opportunity to unleash its own brand of terror. As the moon rose high and bathed the forest in an eerie glow, the air grew thick with an unnatural chill. The warlock, cloaked in shadows, stood at the center of a twisted clearing, his incantations echoing through the trees. He reveled in the growing strength of his magic, oblivious to the dark presence that now watched him from the depths of the woods. Eyes that glinted with a predatory hunger peered through the underbrush, fixated on the warlock. The creature moved silently, its form shifting and blending seamlessly with the night. Each step brought it closer to its prey, drawn irresistibly to the dark magic that flowed through the warlock's veins. It could feel the power, taste the corruption, and it craved more. The warlock paused, sensing a disturbance in the air. He cast a wary glance around the clearing, but saw nothing. Yet, the feeling of being watched persisted, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. He resumed his incantations, more forcefully this time, as if to ward off the creeping dread. Unbeknownst to him, the creature was now only a breath away, its presence cloaked in shadow. It watched, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, to consume the dark magic that had drawn it from its slumber. The warlock's fate was sealed, though he knew it not. For in the heart of that ancient forest, something far more sinister than he could ever imagine had awakened, and it hungered for the darkness he so carelessly wielded. As the warlock completed his ritual, a cold voice broke the silence. "Your power calls to me, warlock," it whispered, sending a shiver down his spine. The warlock turned, eyes wide, to face the creature emerging from the shadows. "I am drawn to your darkness, as you are to mine," the creature continued, its form still obscured by the night. "We are bound by forces beyond our understanding, connected by the threads of ancient magic. Join me, and together we shall wield a power that this world has never seen." The warlock, though wary, felt a strange kinship with the creature. He sensed the truth in its words, the potential of their combined might. He nodded slowly, extending his hand. "Let our darkness become one," he agreed, his voice trembling with anticipation. As their hands clasped, a surge of dark energy erupted from their union, intertwining their fates in an unholy alliance. The villagers of Boren would soon learn the true meaning of terror, for the warlock and the creature had joined forces, bound by the ancient magic that had awakened them both. Together, they would unleash a reign of darkness that none could withstand. Darkness Falls, Part 5. In the days following the unholy alliance between the warlock and the creature, strange occurrences began to plague the village of Boren. The once quiet and somber nights were now filled with the echoes of unnatural sounds, and an eerie glow seemed to emanate from the depths of the forest, casting an ominous light over the land. Down by Captain Crimson's dock, the air grew thick with an unsettling silence. The usually bustling harbor, filled with the sounds of sailors and merchants, was now eerily quiet. The few who ventured close spoke of a strange purple mist that began to creep in with the evening tide, enveloping the ships and the wooden planks of the dock in a surreal haze. Captain Crimson, a seasoned sailor with a reputation for fearlessness, stood at the edge of his dock, staring into the mist. His ship, the Crimson Tide, creaked and groaned as if whispering secrets to the wind. The sails fluttered unnaturally, though there was no breeze, and the anchor chains rattled with a life of their own. "Something's not right," Captain Crimson muttered to himself, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his cutlass. He had faced many dangers on the high seas, but this was different. This was something beyond the realm of the living. As the purple mist thickened, strange shapes began to move within it. Shadows danced and twisted, taking forms that defied explanation. The dock, once a place of commerce and camaraderie, now felt like a portal to another world. The water below, usually a deep blue, glowed with an unnatural purple hue, reflecting the eerie light of the mist. The sailors who had braved the harbor that night felt a chill that cut to their bones. Whispers of disembodied voices floated on the air, speaking in languages long forgotten. The mist seemed to be alive, pulsating with an energy that was both captivating and terrifying. Captain Crimson's eyes narrowed as he peered deeper into the mist. He could see figures moving about his ship, spectral shapes that seemed to be performing tasks as if they were still among the living. His crew, loyal to the last, had all met untimely fates, and now it seemed their spirits had returned, drawn by the same dark magic that had awakened the ancient creature in the forest. A sudden chill ran down his spine as a voice, cold and hollow, echoed from the mist. "Captain Crimson, your time has come. The warlock's power calls to you. Join us in the shadows, and we shall rule the seas together." The captain's grip tightened on his cutlass. "Show yourself," he demanded, though his voice wavered slightly. He was met with silence, the only response the ever-thickening mist and the growing sense of dread. From the heart of the mist, a figure emerged. It was the warlock, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Beside him stood the creature, its form shifting and undulating with an otherworldly presence. They moved closer, their combined power palpable in the air. "The harbor is ours now," the warlock intoned, his voice reverberating with dark magic. "The village of Boren will soon follow. Together, we shall spread our darkness across the land and sea." Captain Crimson stood his ground, though he felt the overwhelming power of the warlock and the creature bearing down on him. The purple mist swirled around his feet, pulling him toward the unholy alliance. He knew then that his fight was no longer just for survival, but for the very soul of Boren. As the warlock and the creature reached out, a surge of dark energy coursed through the dock, and Captain Crimson felt himself being drawn into their malevolent embrace. The last thing he saw before the mist consumed him was the ghostly faces of his crew, their eyes filled with the same dark hunger that now gripped his heart. Darkness Falls, Part 6. As dawn broke over the village of Boren, the thick purple mist that had shrouded the harbor during the night began to dissipate, leaving behind an unsettling calm. The villagers, weary from the recent strange occurrences, emerged from their homes with wary eyes, scanning the horizon for any signs of the unnatural. It was then that the first whispers of Captain Crimson's disappearance began to spread through the town. The Crimson Tide, Captain Crimson's formidable ship, stood eerily silent at the dock. Its once vibrant sails now hung limp, and the ship itself seemed to exude an ominous aura. There was no sign of the captain or his crew, no bustling activity, no shouts of orders, just an unnerving stillness that settled over the harbor like a shroud. Rumors quickly took root among the villagers. Some claimed to have seen ghostly figures moving about the ship during the night, while others swore they had heard disembodied voices carried on the wind. The more superstitious spoke of curses and dark magic, warning that the captain had been claimed by the same forces that haunted the forest. But no one knew for certain what had happened, and the fear of the unknown began to fester. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the village council convened in the town square, a growing crowd of concerned villagers gathering around them. The head councilman, a grizzled old man named Oren, stood before the assembly, his voice grave as he addressed the crowd. "Captain Crimson and his crew are missing," Oren announced, his words sending a ripple of anxiety through the crowd. "His ship remains docked, but there's no trace of him or his men. We must assume the worst, that they have fallen victim to the dark forces that have been plaguing our land." Murmurs of fear and disbelief echoed through the square. Captain Crimson was not just any sailor, he was a symbol of strength and resilience for the village, a man who had faced countless dangers and always returned victorious. The thought that he could simply vanish without a trace was unthinkable. "We must not give in to fear," Oren continued, raising his voice to be heard over the growing unrest. "We owe it to Captain Crimson to search for him. If there's a chance he's still out there, we must find him and bring him back. Who among you will join the search party?" There was a moment of hesitation, but then a burly fisherman named Garin stepped forward. "I'll go," he declared, his voice firm. "Captain Crimson's done more for this village than anyone. If he's in trouble, we can't just leave him." One by one, others joined Garin, hardened sailors, young men eager to prove themselves, and even a few of the village's more adventurous women. The search party soon took shape, a determined group of villagers ready to brave the unknown. Before they set out, Oren approached Garin and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Be careful," he warned, his eyes dark with concern. "Whatever has taken Captain Crimson may still be out there. We can't afford to lose any more of our people." Garin nodded grimly. "We'll find him, Oren, and we'll bring him back." With that, the search party made their way down to the dock, their steps heavy with both determination and dread. The morning sun did little to dispel the lingering sense of unease as they boarded a smaller ship, the Mistbreaker, and prepared to sail out in search of their missing captain. As the Mistbreaker set sail, the villagers left behind could only watch and wait, their hearts heavy with fear for what the search party might find, or what might find them. The disappearance of Captain Crimson had shaken the village to its core, and they knew that whatever dark forces had claimed him would not be easily defeated. The search party sailed into the unknown, following the faint trail of purple mist that still lingered over the water. The forest loomed ominously in the distance, its twisted trees a reminder of the dark magic that had taken root in their land. With each passing hour, the sense of foreboding grew, and the villagers who had stayed behind could only pray that their friends would return before the darkness claimed them as well. Darkness Fall Part 7. As the Mistbreaker sailed further from the harbor and deeper into the unknown, the villagers back in Boren clung to a fragile hope that Captain Crimson and his crew would be found. But what they did not know was that their beloved captain was already far beyond their reach, ensnared by forces far darker than they could imagine. In the depths of the twisted forest, where the warlock's dark magic reigned supreme, a transformation was taking place. The warlock, his eyes glowing with a sinister light, stood before the kneeling figure of Captain Crimson. The captain's once strong form now trembled as the warlock's malevolent power coursed through his veins, reshaping him into something both monstrous and terrifying. "You have been chosen, Captain Crimson," the warlock intoned, his voice echoing through the shadowed clearing. "Chosen to serve a greater purpose, to become an instrument of my will. From this day forth, you shall be known as the Dutchman, the scourge of the seas, feared by all who dare to cross your path." Captain Crimson, now the Dutchman, lifted his head, his eyes no longer filled with the fire of life but with a cold, unnatural glow. His once weathered face was twisted into a mask of torment, and the very air around him seemed to crackle with dark energy. He could feel the warlock's power binding him, twisting his soul into something dark and unrecognizable. "Why?" the Dutchman rasped, his voice barely his own. "Why have you done this to me?" The warlock stepped closer, a twisted smile playing on his lips. "Because you are destined for greater things, Dutchman. You are to be my harbinger, the embodiment of the darkness that will sweep across this land. But before you can truly serve, you must understand the roots of this darkness, my darkness." The warlock paused, his gaze growing distant as if recalling a long-buried memory. "You see, this dark reign of mine is not born of mere ambition or cruelty. It is the product of a long-estranged relationship, one that has festered for years, fueling my descent into this abyss." The Dutchman remained silent, listening intently as the warlock continued. "I was not always the warlock you see before you. Once, I was simply a man, one of two brothers. My brother, the Crusader, was everything that I was not: noble, righteous, dedicated to the cause of good. But where he chose the path of light, I was left behind in the shadows, forgotten and abandoned." The warlock's eyes burned with a mixture of anger and sorrow. The Crusader, in his self-righteousness, believed he could save the world, but he could not save me. He left me to rot in the darkness, to fend for myself in a world that had no place for someone like me. And so, I embraced the dark arts, the only thing that offered me solace. I became what I am now, a master of dark magic, driven by the desire to reclaim what was lost. He turned to the Dutchman, his expression hardening. But the pain of that abandonment never left me. It became a festering wound, a source of power and purpose. My brother's choice to fight for good left me to a life of torment, a life that I now repay by spreading the darkness he once shunned. And you, Dutchman, are a part of that retribution." The Dutchman felt a pang of sympathy beneath the layers of dark magic that now clouded his mind. He could feel the warlock's anguish, the betrayal that had twisted him into the creature of shadows he had become. But the darkness that bound him was too strong, and any remnants of his former self were quickly smothered by the warlock's influence. "And what of the Crusader?" the Dutchman asked, his voice hollow. "Where is he now?" The warlock's smile turned cold. "He roams the land, still fighting his futile battles, still believing he can bring light to a world that is slipping further into darkness. But he cannot stop what is coming. The darkness I have sown will consume all, and the Crusader will be forced to watch as everything he holds dear falls to ruin." The Dutchman lowered his gaze, resigned to his fate. He could feel the warlocks were shaping him into the monster he was destined to become, a servant of darkness, forever bound to the warlock's twisted purpose. The warlock placed a hand on the Dutchman's shoulder, his grip firm. "Together, we will bring the Crusader to his knees. We will make him understand the price of his choices, and he will see the true power of the darkness he left behind." As the Dutchman rose to his feet, he felt the warlock's dark magic pulsing through him, filling him with a sense of purpose, however twisted it might be. The man who had once been Captain Crimson was no more. In his place stood the Dutchman, a harbinger of doom, ready to serve the warlock's dark vision. And so, as the village of Boren held its breath, waiting for the return of their lost captain, they had no way of knowing that the man they sought was now something far more dangerous, a creature of darkness, bound by ancient magic and driven by a desire for revenge against a brother who had chosen the light over the shadows. The Dutchman would soon set sail, and with him, the darkness would spread, until there was no place left in the world for the light. Darkness Falls, Part 8. In the deepest recesses of the twisted forest, where the air was thick with the scent of decay and the trees seemed to whisper secrets of the damned, the warlock prepared for his next dark ritual. The night was still, unnaturally so, as if the very world was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The warlock, cloaked in shadows, stood before an ancient altar, his eyes glowing with a sickly light as he chanted in a language that had long been forgotten by all but the darkest of souls. His voice echoed through the clearing, a low, sinister murmur that seemed to resonate with the very earth beneath his feet. The warlock knew that his power, formidable as it was, would not be enough to bring Boren to its knees. The villagers clung stubbornly to their light, their hope, and, most of all, to the Crusader, his brother, who had betrayed him long ago by choosing the path of righteousness. The thought of his brother, the so-called hero, standing in his way, fueled the warlock's determination. But it also reminded him of the limitations of his own dark power. He needed more. More power. More darkness. Something beyond the ancient spells he had mastered. Something primal and untamed, a force that could not be reasoned with or controlled, only unleashed. The warlock's fingers trembled with a mix of excitement and fear as he began to weave a new incantation, one that called upon forces that had been buried deep within the earth, sealed away for the very reason that they could not be controlled. The night around him grew darker, the shadows deepening as the warlock's voice rose, the ancient words flowing from his lips like venom. The ground beneath him began to tremble, and the air grew heavy with the scent of sulfur and ash. The trees, once silent, now groaned and creaked as if in protest, their twisted limbs reaching out as if to stop the ritual before it could go any further. But the warlock was beyond reason. He could feel the power building, a raw, untamed force that surged up from the earth, responding to his call. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized that he was on the verge of summoning something truly terrible, something that even he might not be able to control. But he did not care. All that mattered was the power, the darkness that would be his to command. As the final words of the incantation left his lips, the earth beneath the altar cracked open with a deafening roar, and a column of dark energy shot into the sky, piercing the heavens. The warlock staggered back, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear as he beheld the result of his dark work. The energy that swirled around him was unlike anything he had ever felt before, wild, chaotic, and ancient. For a moment, he wondered if he had gone too far, if the power he had summoned would consume him instead of serving him. But the thought was fleeting, drowned out by the intoxicating rush of the darkness that now filled the clearing. Whatever he had called forth, whatever nightmare he had unleashed, it was here now, and it was powerful beyond his wildest dreams. The warlock took a deep breath, steadying himself as he reached out to touch the swirling energy. It pulsed beneath his fingertips, almost as if it were alive, responding to his touch with a sense of malevolent intent. He could feel the presence of something, no, many things, lurking within the darkness, waiting to be set free. A twisted smile spread across the warlock's face as he realized the truth. This power, this darkness, was not just his to command, it was a force of nature, a living nightmare that would engulf Boren and its pitiful defenders in a tide of fear and despair. And with it, he would finally have the power to crush the Crusader and take his rightful place as the true ruler of the land. But as the warlock prepared to unleash this new force upon the world, a sliver of doubt crept into his mind. What if he had miscalculated? What if the darkness he had summoned was beyond even his control? What if, in his quest for power, he had unleashed something that could not be contained? The thought was quickly buried beneath the weight of his ambition, but it lingered in the back of his mind like a dark shadow. The warlock pushed it aside, focusing instead on the power that now flowed through him. He had come too far to turn back now. As the night deepened and the clearing was consumed by the swirling darkness, the warlock laughed, a sound that echoed through the forest like the tolling of a bell. Whatever the consequences, whatever the cost, he was ready to face it. The darkness was his to command, and soon, Boren would fall. But in the depths of the twisted forest, where the light could not reach, something stirred in response to the warlock's call. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for just such an opportunity. The warlock, in his quest for power, had awakened more than just a force of darkness. He had summoned the very nightmares that had long been forgotten, and they were coming. Coming soon. Darkness Falls, Part 9. As the warlock's dark ritual sent ripples of malevolent energy through the forest, the air grew thick with anticipation. The ground trembled, and the twisted trees groaned under the weight of the power being unleashed. The warlock stood at the center of it all, eyes gleaming with triumph as he felt the surge of ancient forces responding to his call. But in the depths of the darkness, something far more sinister had begun to stir, something that had once been the source of nightmares for generations. The thin man, a figure once whispered about in hushed tones and feared in the darkest corners of the world, had returned. Long ago, the thin man had been nothing more than an urban legend, a creature of pure terror who preyed on the fears of children. Alongside the boogeyman, he had roamed the night, slipping through the cracks of reality to snatch away those who were foolish enough to stray too far from the safety of their homes. His name alone was enough to send shivers down the spines of parents and children alike, and for years, he had reigned as the unseen horror that lurked in the shadows. But his reign of terror had not gone unchallenged. The Wizard of Boren, a powerful and wise figure who had dedicated his life to protecting the innocent, had finally put an end to the thin man's dark deeds. After 2 long years of terrorizing the village's children, the thin man was banished by the wizard, sealed away in a place where even nightmares feared to tread. Yet now, after years of being forgotten, his name nothing more than a distant memory, the thin man had been called forth once again by the warlock's dark magic. And with his return came a burning hatred for the village of Boren, for its children, and most of all, for the wizard who had cast him out. As the warlock's ritual reached its peak, a chilling wind swept through the forest, carrying with it the faintest echoes of children's laughter that quickly twisted into cries of fear. The warlock's smile faltered for a moment as he felt a presence unlike any he had summoned before. It was cold, insidious, and filled with a malice that seemed to seep into the very fabric of reality. From the depths of the shadows, a figure began to emerge, tall, impossibly thin, and more shadow than flesh. The warlock's breath caught in his throat as he beheld the thin man, his form barely distinguishable from the darkness that surrounded him. His long, spindly fingers seemed to reach out toward the warlock, not in a gesture of aggression, but as if testing the boundaries of this new world he had been brought into. The warlock, regaining his composure, inclined his head in acknowledgement. "I have called you, nightmare of old, to join my cause. The village of Boren has stood defiant for too long, protected by fools who believe in the light. But with you at my side, we shall shatter their illusions and bring true terror to their hearts." The thin man did not speak, he never did. His presence alone was enough to convey his intent. The warlock could feel the deep-seated hatred that pulsed from the creature, a hatred that had been festering for years, waiting for the moment when it could be unleashed upon the world once more. The warlock continued, sensing the opportunity to harness this powerful ally. The children of Boren still laugh, still play, unaware of the darkness that lies in wait. They believe themselves safe, protected by their parents, by the memory of the wizard who once banished you. But that memory will be their undoing. They will know fear as they have never known before, and you will have your revenge. A low, almost imperceptible whisper seemed to escape from the thin man, a sound that sent a shiver down the warlock's spine. It was the sound of agreement, of a pact made in the shadows. The warlock had given him what he desired most, the chance to return, to resume his reign of terror, and to claim the children of Boren as his own. With a final flourish, the warlock completed his ritual, sealing the bond between himself and the thin man. The air crackled with dark energy as the clearing grew impossibly cold, the shadows deepening as if the very night was bending to the thin man's will. The warlock could feel the power coursing through him, amplified by the presence of his new ally. Together, they would bring an end to Boren's defiance. And so, as the thin man melted back into the shadows, his form disappearing into the darkness from whence he came, the warlock knew that the time for subtlety had passed. The children of Boren would soon face a terror that their parents had only whispered about in the dead of night, a terror that had returned with a vengeance. In the days to come, the villagers of Boren would begin to notice strange occurrences, flickering lights in their homes, shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. The children, once carefree, would start to speak of a figure that appeared in their dreams, a figure so thin and tall that it defied logic. But by then, it would be too late. The thin man was here, and with him came the full force of the warlock's dark power. The warlock stood alone in the clearing, the echoes of his ritual fading into the night. The wind carried with it the faintest sound of children's laughter, laughter that quickly twisted into cries of fear. His lips curled into a smile as he imagined the chaos that would soon descend upon Boren. The thin man was back, and this time, there would be no wizard to stop him. Darkness Falls, Part 10. The village of Boren had always been a place of quiet routines and simple pleasures. The villagers worked hard, celebrated the changing of the seasons, and cherished the small moments of joy that life offered. But there was one event that stood apart from the rest, an event that brought both excitement and unease in equal measure, the arrival of the Carney. Every year, as the leaves began to turn and the air grew crisp with the promise of autumn, the Carney would roll into town with his carnival. His arrival was always unannounced, the sight of his garishly painted wagons appearing on the horizon like a mirage. The children of Boren would run ahead, eager to see the bright colors, hear the lively music, and lose themselves in the wonder of the strange and wondrous attractions that the Carney offered. But for all its enchantment, there was something undeniably unsettling about the carnival, a feeling that lingered just beneath the surface, like a shadow cast by the flickering lights of the midway. The Carney himself was a figure of mystery, a man whose face seemed ageless and whose eyes held a glint of something far older than his years. He was charming in a way that made the parents of Boren uneasy, though they could never quite put their finger on why. There was a darkness in his smile, a sense that the joy he offered came at a cost, though none could say what that cost might be. But this year, as the Carney prepared his wagons and tightened the ropes of his tents, something was different. The warlock's dark magic had spread through the land, and its influence reached even the far corners where the Carney's carnival was hidden away. The whispers of ancient evil, the power that pulsed through the earth, awakened something within the Carney, something that had lain dormant for far too long. As he stood in the center of his deserted carnival, surrounded by the silent, empty rides and attractions, the carny felt a stirring deep within his soul. The feeling was familiar, a darkness that he had once known all too well but had kept at bay for years. But now, the warlock's influence had brought it roaring back to life, and with it came memories of the man he had once been, a man who reveled in the fear and despair of those who fell under his spell. A slow, sinister smile spread across the carny's face as he realized what this meant. The warlock's power had reignited the flame of his own malevolence, and he could feel it growing stronger with each passing moment. The carnival had always been a place of both delight and dread, but now, it would become something far more sinister. He would no longer be content with merely unsettling the villagers of Boren. He would draw them in, ensnare them, and offer them up to the darkness that had rekindled his true nature. The carny's mind raced with possibilities, and his heart quickened with the thrill of what was to come. The carnival was already a place of strange wonders, but now he would twist those wonders into nightmares. The rides would not just thrill but terrify, the games would not just entertain but deceive, and the sideshow attractions, once merely odd, would become grotesque displays of the macabre. But most of all, it would be the children who would suffer. The carny's smile widened as he imagined the look of terror in their eyes when they realized that the carnival was no longer a place of innocent fun, but a trap, a snare that would draw them in and never let them go. The warlock wanted to bring fear to Boren, to break the spirits of its people, and the carny would be his willing accomplice. As he began to make preparations, the carny hummed a tune, a haunting melody that seemed to echo through the empty tents and rides. His hands moved with a purpose, setting the stage for the horrors that would soon unfold. The brightly colored banners were replaced with darker shades, the cheerful music of the calliope slowed to a discordant wail, and the once welcoming lights of the carnival grew dim, casting long, eerie shadows. When the time came, and the carnival once again appeared on the outskirts of Boren, the villagers would feel that familiar mix of excitement and unease. But this time, there would be something more, an inexplicable sense of dread that would settle over the town like a shroud. The carny would greet them with his usual charm, but beneath his smile would lurk a darkness that they could not see, but would soon feel. As the first children ran ahead to greet the carnival, the carny stood at the entrance, tipping his hat with a flourish. "Step right up, boys and girls," he called out, his voice smooth and inviting. "The fun is about to begin." But this year, the fun would not end with the setting of the sun. This year, the carny's carnival would be a gateway to nightmares, and once the villagers of Boren stepped inside, they would find that there was no way out. The carny had been awakened by the warlock's dark magic, and now, he was ready to play his part in the grand design of terror that was about to unfold. As the villagers approached, the carny's eyes gleamed with malevolent anticipation. This year, the carnival would not just be a place of creepy curiosities, it would be a place of horror, where the children and families of Boren would face their darkest fears. And the carny, with the warlock's power fueling his malevolence, would be there to guide them every step of the way. The carnival had arrived, and this time, it would be their last. Darkness Falls, Part 11. The village of Boren had descended into chaos. The once peaceful town was now a place of fear and despair, its streets shrouded in shadows and its people plagued by nightmares. The warlock's dark magic had taken hold, spreading like a sickness that drained the very life from the land. The children of Boren no longer played outside, their laughter replaced by cries of terror as the thin man and the carny worked their twisted machinations. The adults, too, were gripped by dread, whispering of the horrors that had befallen them, of the carnival that had turned sinister, and of the nightmares that now stalked their every waking moment. For weeks, the villagers had pleaded for help, their desperate cries echoing through the town square. They had called upon the hero, the one who had always been there to protect them, to save them from the darkness. But the hero had not appeared, and the people of Boren had begun to lose hope. Until now, on a moonless night, when the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly and the air was thick with the weight of despair, the hero finally answered the call. Clad in armor that gleamed like silver and armed with a sword forged from the purest steel, the hero stepped forward from the edge of the forest, his eyes blazing with determination. He was a figure of strength and resolve, a beacon of hope in a world that had been consumed by darkness. The villagers watched in awe as the hero made his way to the heart of the village, where the warlock's influence was strongest. The warlock, sensing the hero's presence, emerged from the depths of the twisted forest, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. He had been waiting for this moment, knowing that the hero would eventually come. But he was not afraid. The warlock had prepared for this battle, and he had allies that the hero could not have anticipated. As the hero and the warlock faced each other in the center of the village, the tension in the air was palpable. The villagers, too afraid to approach, watched from the shadows, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew that this battle would decide the fate of Boren, whether they would be saved from the darkness or consumed by it. The hero raised his sword, the blade catching what little light remained in the night. "Your reign of terror ends here," he declared, his voice strong and unwavering. "You will not harm these people any longer." The warlock's lips curled into a twisted smile. "You are a fool, hero. You cannot stop what has already begun. The darkness is too powerful, even for you." Without another word, the hero lunged forward, his sword slicing through the air with deadly precision. The warlock met his attack with a blast of dark energy, but the hero's blade cut through it, sending the warlock stumbling back. The villagers gasped, daring to hope that the hero might actually defeat the warlock. The battle raged on, the clash of steel against magic reverberating through the village. The hero fought with all the strength and skill he possessed, his movements swift and sure as he pressed the warlock further back. The warlock, though powerful, found himself struggling to keep up with the hero's relentless assault. For the first time in weeks, it seemed as though the tide had turned in Boren's favor. With a final, powerful strike, the hero knocked the warlock to the ground, his sword poised to deliver the finishing blow. The villagers held their breath, their eyes wide with anticipation. The warlock, now at the hero's mercy, looked up at his opponent, a strange glint in his eyes. "You think you've won?" The warlock hissed, his voice filled with venom. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Just as the hero prepared to strike, a cold wind swept through the village, carrying with it a feeling of utter dread. From the shadows, a figure began to emerge, tall, impossibly thin, and more shadow than flesh. The thin man had arrived. Before the hero could react, the thin man moved with inhuman speed, his long, spindly fingers wrapping around the hero's wrist and arm, restraining him with a grip that was cold as death. The villagers gasped in horror as they watched the hero struggle against the terrifying figure, his sword clattering to the ground as the thin man's hold tightened. The warlock rose to his feet, a cruel smile spreading across his face as he watched the thin man subdue the hero. "Did you really think you could defeat me alone?" The warlock taunted, his voice dripping with malice. "I have allies that you could never hope to overcome." The hero strained against the thin man's grip, but it was no use. The figure's strength was unnatural, his very presence draining the life and hope from the hero's body. The warlock stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with dark triumph as he raised his hands, beginning to chant in the ancient tongue of his dark magic. The air crackled with energy as the warlock prepared to cast his spell, his voice growing louder with each passing moment. The hero, now helpless in the thin man's grasp, could do nothing but watch as the warlock's magic swirled around him, a dark force that seemed to reach out for his very soul. "No," the hero gasped, his voice filled with desperation. But it was too late. With a final, triumphant shout, the warlock unleashed his spell, a wave of dark magic crashing over the hero like a tidal wave. The villagers cried out in despair as they watched their champion falter, his body convulsing as the warlock's magic took hold. The thin man's grip tightened, holding the hero in place as the darkness consumed him. The warlock's laughter echoed through the village, a sound that sent chills down the spines of all who heard it. The hero, once a symbol of hope and light, was now at the mercy of the warlock's power, his fate hanging in the balance. As the chapter closed, the thin man continued to restrain the hero, his shadowy form a stark contrast to the brilliant light that the hero had once embodied. The warlock, his eyes gleaming with victory, stepped forward to deliver the final blow, his dark magic poised to claim the hero's soul. The village of Boren, once filled with hope, now stood on the brink of utter despair, their last, best hopes seemingly crushed beneath the weight of the warlock's malevolent power. Darkness Falls, Part 12. As the warlock's dark spell enveloped the hero, the once proud champion of Boren felt a surge of unimaginable pain. The darkness that the warlock had conjured was no ordinary curse, it was a force designed to corrupt, to twist and warp the very soul of its target. The hero, who had once been the embodiment of light and hope, now found himself drowning in a sea of shadows, his mind awash with thoughts that were not his own. But as the darkness took hold, something within the hero began to change. The pain that had racked his body subsided, replaced by a cold, creeping sensation that settled deep in his heart. The thoughts that flooded his mind, thoughts of hatred, resentment, and bitterness, no longer felt foreign. Instead, they felt right, as if they had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when they could be set free. The villagers of Boren, still hiding in the shadows, watched in horror as the hero's transformation began. His once bright armor dulled to a menacing black, the silver sheen turning to a cold, unforgiving metal that seemed to absorb the light around it. His face, once noble and kind, twisted into a sneer, his eyes glowing with a dark, malevolent fire. The hero was no more. In his place stood something far more dangerous, a villain born from the deepest recesses of his own soul. The warlock, his spell complete, stepped back and observed his handiwork with satisfaction. The thin man released his grip, and the newly transformed villain straightened, flexing his fingers as if testing the limits of his newfound power. There was a cruel confidence in his movements, a swagger that had not been there before. As the villagers looked on, too terrified to move, the villain turned his gaze toward them. Gone was the protector they had once revered. In his place stood a figure who looked at them not with compassion, but with disdain. "Look at you," the villain sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Pathetic, cowering fools. Did you really think I fought for you? For this miserable town?" He laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed through the empty square. "I've been your hero for far too long, and where has it gotten me? Groveling at the feet of a village that doesn't deserve my protection." The villagers shrank back, their fear palpable as the villain continued his tirade. "Boren," he spat the name as though it were a curse. "A town of weaklings and fools, led by a wizard who's done nothing but keep you all under his thumb. You think he's your savior? He's nothing but a self-righteous coward, hiding behind his spells while you grovel for scraps of his protection." Intrusive thoughts swirled in the villain's mind, feeding the growing darkness within him. He remembered the countless times he had fought to defend Boren, risking his life for a people who had never truly appreciated him. The resentment he had buried deep inside now bubbled to the surface, unfiltered and unrestrained. "The wizard," the villain snarled, his voice filled with venom. "Always there to clean up your messes, to pat you on the head and tell you everything will be all right. But where is he now? Hiding, as usual, while I face the true dangers of this world. And what do I get in return? Nothing. No gratitude, no recognition, just the expectation that I'll always be there to save you." He took a step toward the villagers, who recoiled in terror. "But I see things clearly now," the villain continued, his tone growing colder. "This town isn't worth saving. None of you are. You've done nothing but leech off my strength, taking and taking while I've given everything. But no more." The warlock watched with a satisfied smile as the villain's transformation completed, the darkness fully entrenched in his soul. The hero, once a beacon of hope, had become the very thing he had fought against, cruel, arrogant, and consumed by hatred. "You've all relied on me for too long," the villain said, his voice a deadly whisper. "But that ends now. From this moment on, you will know true fear. The wizard can't save you, and neither can I, because now, I'm the one you should fear." The villagers, paralyzed by terror, could do nothing but watch as the villain turned his back on them, his mind already turning to thoughts of revenge. Revenge against the wizard who had overshadowed him, revenge against the town that had taken him for granted, and revenge against anyone who dared to challenge his newfound power. As he walked away, the villain's laughter filled the night air, a sound that sent chills down the spines of all who heard it. Boren, once a town of hope and light, was now a place of darkness and despair, its protector turned enemy. The warlock had won, but the villain's victory felt even more complete, for the true battle had not been fought with swords or spells, but within the soul of the hero himself. And now, with the hero transformed into a villain, the people of Boren would suffer as they had never suffered before. The darkness had taken root, and there was no one left to save them. Darkness Falls, Part 13. In the heart of Boren, nestled in a forgotten alley where the cobblestones were cracked and overgrown with moss, there stood an old, decrepit workshop. Its windows were thick with dust, and its door hung slightly ajar, as if inviting, or perhaps warning, any who might dare to enter. For as long as anyone could remember, the workshop had belonged to a solitary figure known only as the dollmaker. The dollmaker had once been a respected craftsman, his skill with wood and cloth unrivaled in the village. Parents would bring their children to his workshop, eager to commission one of his lifelike dolls, each more beautiful and intricate than the last. The dolls seemed to possess a certain magic, their glassy eyes twinkling with a spark of life that made them almost seem real. But as time passed, the villagers began to notice something unsettling about the dollmaker's creations, something that made them wonder if there was more to his craft than mere skill. And then, 1 year ago, the workshop had fallen silent. The shutters were drawn, the door closed, and no more dolls emerged from within. The dollmaker himself had vanished from sight, and the villagers, though relieved, could not help but feel a sense of dread whenever they passed the old shop. It was as if something dark had taken root there, something that was waiting for the right moment to awaken. That moment had come. As the warlock's dark magic spread through Boren, its tendrils reached even the forgotten corners of the village, stirring the shadows and awakening the slumbering evils that had lain dormant for too long. In the depths of the dollmaker's workshop, the black string that bound the last of his creations suddenly pulsed with life, the dark energy infusing it with a malevolent purpose. The dollmaker, who had retreated into a reclusive silence over the past year, now found himself confronted with the consequences of his art. The dolls that had once been mere playthings were no longer content to sit idle on their shelves. The dark magic coursing through the workshop had breathed life into them, life that was far from innocent. The dollmaker, hunched over his workbench, watched in horror as his creations began to stir. Their tiny limbs twitched, their glass eyes blinking open as if waking from a long sleep. The dolls, once beautiful and delicate, now moved with an unnatural grace, their expressions twisted into sinister smiles that sent chills down the dollmaker's spine. He had always known there was something different about his dolls, something that set them apart from ordinary toys. But this was beyond his control. The dark magic that had infiltrated his workshop had twisted his creations into something monstrous, something that no longer obeyed his commands. The dollmaker reached out with trembling hands, trying to regain control of the situation. "No," he whispered, his voice shaky. "Stop this. You must obey me." But the dolls paid him no heed. They scurried across the workbench, their tiny feet clicking against the wood as they darted into the shadows. The dollmaker's workshop, once a place of creativity and craftsmanship, had become a playground for these malevolent beings. His own creations, now turned against him. The dollmaker could hear the patter of tiny feet all around him, the sound of whispers in the dark as the dolls moved through the shadows. They were everywhere, in the cupboards, under the tables, in the rafters above. He could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting. They were no longer content to be passive objects. They were alive, and they were hungry for something more. The dollmaker's heart raced as he realized the full extent of what he had done. He had poured his soul into these creations, and now they had taken on a life of their own, one that he could no longer control. The dark string that bound them, infused with the warlock's evil, had turned them into something malevolent, something that thrived on chaos and fear. He stumbled back from his workbench, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way to undo what had been done. But it was too late. The dolls had already taken over the workshop, their tiny voices whispering secrets in the dark, their movements swift and purposeful as they set about their own mysterious tasks. The dollmaker could only watch in horror as his creations moved with a will of their own, each doll a reflection of the darkness that had taken root within him. They were no longer mere toys, they were his nightmares made flesh, and they were far from harmless. One doll, in particular, caught the dollmaker's eye. It was a small, delicate figure dressed in a tattered gown, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. The doll turned its head slowly to face him, a twisted smile spreading across its porcelain face. The dollmaker felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that this doll, more than any other, embodied the darkness that had consumed his soul. "You were supposed to be beautiful," the dollmaker whispered, his voice filled with regret. "You were supposed to bring joy, not this. Not this horror." But the doll merely tilted its head, its smile widening as if mocking him. It was then that the dollmaker understood the truth. The dolls were no longer his creations, they were his masters. The dark magic that had given them life had also given them power, and they were no longer content to be controlled. With a sudden burst of courage, the dollmaker grabbed a knife from his workbench, determined to cut the black string that bound the dolls to life. But as he approached the doll, it moved with lightning speed, its tiny hand reaching out to stop him. The dollmaker froze, the knife slipping from his grasp as he realized the futility of his actions. The dolls were beyond his control, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. The dark string that had brought them to life had also bound them to the warlock's will, and now they were part of something far greater, something that the dollmaker could never hope to understand or defeat. The dollmaker slumped to the floor, his strength drained as he watched the dolls continue their eerie dance around the workshop. They moved with purpose, their tiny hands crafting new horrors in the shadows, their whispers growing louder as they plotted and schemed. The dollmaker could only sit and watch as his workshop became a place of nightmares, a place where the darkness reigned supreme. And as the night deepened, the dollmaker realized that he was no longer the master of his creations. He was their prisoner, trapped in a nightmare of his own making, with no hope of escape. The dolls, once objects of beauty, had become instruments of evil, and the dollmaker was powerless to stop them. In the heart of Boren, the old workshop stood silent once more, its windows dark and its door closed. But within its walls, the dolls continued to move in the shadows, their tiny voices whispering secrets of the darkness that had given them life. The dollmaker's silence had been broken, and in its place had come a nightmare that would haunt the village of Boren for years to come. Darkness Falls, Part 14. In a small town not far from yours, life had always been uneventful. People went about their daily routines, blissfully unaware of the dark storm brewing in the nearby cursed village. Among them was a man, ordinary in every sense. He had a decent job, a modest apartment, and was a long-time customer of Fable Beard Co, religiously collecting new releases and limited editions. The man lived for the fantasy stories behind the products, but what he didn't realize was that something in those stories, something real, was reaching out to him. The evil of the warlock in Boren was spreading, and he was one of its newest victims. It began slowly, like a whisper in the back of his mind, but soon it became impossible to ignore. It happened one evening at the butcher counter of his local grocery store. He had stopped to pick up some steaks for dinner, the usual Friday night routine. But this time, as he waited for the butcher to prepare his order, something strange took hold of him. His eyes locked onto the slabs of raw meat behind the glass display, and a feeling of unease washed over him. He couldn't look away. The marbling of the steaks, the delicate patterns of fat running through the deep red muscle, became mesmerizing. The texture, the color, the way the meat glistened under the fluorescent lights, it was all too captivating. He felt his heart race, his palms growing clammy as he stared, almost in a trance. It wasn't just the look of the meat, though. It was the thought of blood. Fresh, warm blood. He imagined it pooling under the knife, spilling onto the cold steel of the butcher's table. He could smell it, or at least he thought he could. It filled his senses, and his mouth watered at the thought of tasting it, of feeling its warmth between his fingers. Minutes passed, and he hadn't moved. The butcher cleared her throat, startling him from his daze. "Anything else for you today?" the butcher asked, looking at him curiously. The man shook his head, suddenly aware of how strange he must have seemed, staring at the meat as if it held some great secret. He muttered a quick thanks and grabbed his order, leaving the store as fast as he could. But the strange feelings wouldn't leave him. In fact, they were growing stronger. Each time he passed the butcher counter in the following days, the same thing happened. The marbling of the meat called to him, but this time it wasn't just fascination. It was hunger. A deep, primal hunger that scared him. It wasn't long before it wasn't just about the meat. He began to notice the people around him, particularly the young woman behind the butcher counter who served him every week. She had always been friendly, offering a smile as she wrapped his order. But lately, he saw her differently. His eyes followed her movements, the way her hands touched the meat, the way her veins pulsed under her skin as she worked. There was something about the sight of her now that filled him with a dark, unsettling desire. The more he tried to push these thoughts away, the more they consumed him. Each time he stood at the butcher counter, he felt the urge to stay longer, to watch her more closely. His mind wandered to places he didn't want it to go, places where blood wasn't just a thought, it was a need. He tried to tell himself that it was just a strange phase, a side effect of stress or some other mundane explanation. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Something had changed in him ever since he first heard whispers of Boren's curse. He had always loved the stories of Fable Beard Co, the fantasy and the adventure. But now, the fantasy felt too real, too personal. As if the warlock's dark magic wasn't just a story, he could feel it creeping into his own life. At night, he lay awake, haunted by images of blood, of flesh, of something darker stirring inside him. His thoughts were no longer his own. He could sense the warlock's influence, a malevolent presence that whispered to him, feeding his darkest impulses. He didn't know how much longer he could keep it hidden. The people around him had no idea what was happening inside him, but soon, he feared they would. He wasn't sure how long he could control the urges, the growing need for blood that seemed to pulse through his veins, stronger with each passing day. As he returned to the butcher counter one evening, the familiar pull of darkness washed over him. He smiled at the young woman behind the counter, but this time, it wasn't a friendly smile. There was something else behind it. Something sinister. He wasn't sure how much longer he could resist. The warlock's evil had reached him, and it was only a matter of time before he gave in. The normal life he once knew was slipping away, replaced by a hunger he couldn't explain. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to fight it anymore. Darkness Falls, Part 15. In the dense, unending woods surrounding the village of Boren, the marksman had always felt at home. Known across the land for his unparalleled skills with a bow, he had ventured into the forest countless times, tracking elusive prey and protecting the village from unseen threats. But today, something was different. The forest seemed denser, the shadows darker, and a strange silence hung heavy in the air. As the marksman followed a familiar trail, the trees seemed to close in around him, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. He noticed the path, once well-trodden, now seemed overgrown, as if no one had walked it in years. With each step, a creeping unease settled over him, a sense that he was being watched, that he was not alone in these woods. The sun, which had been bright when he started his journey, now seemed to struggle to pierce the canopy above, its light dimming with every passing hour. The marksman checked his surroundings, trying to shake the feeling of disorientation, but as he continued along the trail, he realized that something was terribly wrong. No matter how far he walked, the scenery seemed to loop back on itself. The same gnarled tree, the same broken branch on the path, the same eerie call of a distant bird, repeating over and over again as if he was stuck in a loop. Hours turned into days, or so it seemed to the marksman. Time itself became a blur, the cycle of light and darkness melding into one. He could no longer tell if he was moving forward or merely retracing his steps. Panic set in as he felt a creeping madness beginning to take hold, the isolation and repetition gnawing at his sanity. Meanwhile, far from the looping woods, in a dark chamber deep within his lair, the warlock gazed into a pool of swirling purple goo. The surface shimmered with a sinister light, showing him not just visions but the very thoughts and perceptions of the marksman. With a cruel smile, the warlock whispered incantations, his words twisting the reality experienced by the distant archer. "The forest is your prison, marksman," the warlock murmured as he manipulated the goo with his hands, casting ripples across its surface. "Lost in your own mind, a maze from which there is no escape." In the woods, the marksman, driven by desperation, continued to fight against the illusion, unaware that his physical body was elsewhere, his mind ensnared by the warlock's spell. Shadows moved at the edge of his vision, shapes and whispers just out of reach, driving him further into despair. His once sharp instincts were dulled by the relentless monotony and the growing dread that he might never escape. As the illusion perpetrated by the warlock deepened, the marksman's moments of clarity became fewer and far between. He began talking to himself, his voice the only sound that seemed real in the eerie silence of the loop. His thoughts turned dark, suspicions of being watched, of being hunted, not by something in the woods, but by his own memories and fears. Back in his dark chamber, the warlock watched with satisfaction as the marksman spiraled deeper into confusion and madness. This was no mere physical trap, but a prison for the mind, expertly crafted to feed on the marksman's innermost fears and doubts. As the chapter closed, the fate of the marksman remained uncertain. Lost in a never-ending cycle, trapped within a distorted creation of his own psyche, he was a puppet whose strings were pulled by the malevolent will of the warlock. And as the forest grew darker around him, so too did the hope of ever finding his way back to reality. The marksman, once a symbol of strength and precision, was now ensnared in a battle much greater than any he had ever known, one waged in the depths of his own mind, with his very soul at stake. Darkness Falls, Part 16. As days merged into an indistinguishable haze within the twisted reality of his mind, the marksman's struggle with the looping woods and creeping madness orchestrated by the warlock reached its zenith. The once clear-eyed hunter, known for his precision and calm under pressure, found his resolve crumbling under the relentless assault of illusions and shadows. With each loop through the cursed forest, fragments of his former self fell away, leaving behind a shell driven by darker impulses. The warlock, observing the transformation from his shadowy lair, knew the time was ripe to mold the marksman into a weapon of his own. He infused the looping reality with visions of the wizard, the very symbol of hope and protection for the village of Boren, but twisted these images into grotesque falsehoods. The wizard appeared not as a guardian, but as a tyrant, a usurper who had condemned the marksman to this endless torment. With each cycle, the deceit took deeper root in the marksman's unraveling psyche. One evening, as the false dusk crept through the illusionary forest, the warlock decided it was time to shatter the loop. The woods around the marksman suddenly grew still, and the air thickened with a palpable sense of finality. The shadows drew back to reveal a path leading out of the eternal forest, a path that had never been there before. Hesitant yet desperate, the marksman followed it, each step heavy with the burden of his fractured thoughts. As he emerged from the forest, the transformation was complete. No longer did he see himself as the marksman, the hero who protected the innocent. Instead, he was the mercenary, forged from the darkness of his own despair, a being hell-bent on the destruction of the wizard. His memories twisted by the warlock's machinations, he believed utterly that the wizard was the source of all his suffering. Armed with a lethal blend of rage and unmatched skill, the mercenary set out towards Boren, his mission clear and his resolve unshakable. The warlock, watching through the purple mists of his scrying pool, smiled with satisfaction. This puppet would be his instrument of revenge against the wizard, who had long thwarted his darker designs on the village. The journey back to Boren was a blur to the mercenary. Each step carried the weight of his newfound purpose, and the landscape seemed to shift around him, shaped by the dark will of the warlock. By the time he reached the outskirts of the village, night had fallen, a night darker than any Boren had seen before. Word of his arrival spread quickly. The villagers, who remembered him as the marksman, hid in their homes, whispering fearfully of the change in him. But the mercenary paid them no heed. His focus was singular: find the wizard and end him. Confrontation was inevitable. The wizard, sensing the approach of a darkened soul, met the mercenary at the edge of the village square. The air crackled with magical energy as the two faced each other, the protector of Boren and its would-be destroyer. "You are not yourself, marksman," the wizard said, his voice carrying a mix of sorrow and resolve. "This path you tread leads only to ruin." The mercenary laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the silent buildings. "I am more myself than ever, wizard. You are the cause of my torment, and tonight, it ends." With a fluid motion, he drew his bow, an arrow notched and aimed straight at the wizard's heart. The wizard raised his hands, ready to cast a spell that might save both the mercenary and the village from catastrophe. The standoff, charged with the potential for destruction or redemption, held the entire village in its grip. Above, the stars watched, and the shadows waited, for the outcome of this duel would shape the fate of Boren and all who called it home. The mercenary, driven by dark forces yet harboring the soul of a hero deep within, stood on the precipice, his next choice crucial to the salvation or damnation of all he had once loved. Darkness Falls, Part 17. The wizard, his heart heavy with sorrow and regret, narrowly escaped death at the hands of the mercenary. Their confrontation had been fierce, the air thick with magical tension as the wizard barely deflected each of the mercenary's lethal arrows. In a moment of desperation, the wizard summoned a blinding flash of light, disorienting the mercenary just long enough for him to flee. He ran deeper into the forest that surrounded Boren, the trees becoming thicker and more twisted as he put distance between himself and the village. The mercenary's arrows had grazed him, small cuts that now stung and bled through his robes, but it wasn't the physical pain that weighed most heavily on him. It was the knowledge that the marksman, a once noble protector, had been twisted into a relentless killer, driven to hunt him down by the warlock's dark influence. Night fell quickly, shrouding the forest in a thick darkness. The wizard found a small clearing deep within the woods and stopped to catch his breath. His magic was depleted from the battle, and his mind raced as he tried to piece together a plan to stop the warlock's growing reign of terror. He could still sense the evil stirring in Boren, the warlock's dark tendrils creeping into every corner of the land, threatening to consume everything. But first, he needed to rest and regain his strength. The wizard gathered some fallen branches, lighting a small fire with a wave of his hand. As the flames flickered and danced, casting long shadows around the clearing, he allowed himself a moment to close his eyes, if only to think. He had faced many threats before, but none as personal as this. The marksman's transformation into the mercenary was a tragedy, but it was also a warning. The warlock's power was growing beyond even the wizard's ability to predict or counter. The crackling fire provided some comfort, but an unsettling silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. As the wizard pondered his next steps, a faint rustling sound reached his ears. At first, it seemed like the wind moving through the leaves, but the sound grew louder and more persistent, as if something were creeping through the underbrush. He opened his eyes, peering into the shadows beyond the firelight. Something was out there. Before he could react, a strange and overwhelming sensation washed over him. It was a whispering sound, like thousands of tiny wings fluttering in unison. He looked up and gasped in horror. The night sky, once dotted with stars, was now blotted out by a swarm of dark, shifting shapes, moths, hundreds, no, thousands of them, swirling in the air above him like a living storm. The wizard leaped to his feet, summoning what little magic he had left to create a protective barrier around himself. But the moths descended quickly, their wings flapping furiously as they surrounded him in a suffocating cloud. They battered against his barrier, and the sheer number of them overwhelmed him. His barrier flickered and weakened under the relentless assault, the swarm growing more aggressive with each passing moment. In the center of the swarm, something larger and more sinister began to take shape. The air grew colder, the very presence of this new entity filling the wizard with dread. Slowly, the figure emerged from the darkness, its form tall and hunched, wings extending outward like the cloak of a predator. It was the Mothman, another agent of the warlock's malevolent design. The Mothman stepped forward, its wings twitching as it moved with an unnatural grace. Its eyes, glowing a sickly red, locked onto the wizard, who struggled to maintain his barrier under the increasing weight of the moths. "The warlock sends his regards," the Mothman hissed, its voice a soft, eerie whisper, carried by the wind. "Your time is running out, wizard. You can't protect Boren forever." The wizard gritted his teeth, using the last of his magic to push back against the swarm, but his strength was fading quickly. The Mothman's presence grew closer, the swarm intensifying as it pressed against him from all sides. The wizard felt his barrier falter, cracks forming in the magical shield as the moths found their way through, their wings brushing against his skin, their tiny feet scratching at him. With a final surge of energy, the wizard unleashed a pulse of light, sending the moths scattering for a brief moment. But the Mothman remained unfazed, its dark wings rippling as it stepped closer, a cruel smile playing across its grotesque face. "You cannot escape the darkness," the Mothman said, its voice filled with malice. "You are alone, wizard. The warlock has ensured that." The wizard knew he was outmatched. His magic was nearly depleted, and the Mothman, with the swarm under his command, was relentless. He could feel the pull of the warlock's influence, the creeping sense of despair that threatened to overwhelm him. But the wizard was not one to give up easily. He had survived many battles, and he would not let Boren fall without a fight. As the Mothman prepared to strike, the wizard, with a desperate flick of his wrist, summoned a thick fog, concealing himself in a veil of mist. The Mothman screeched in frustration as the fog swirled around the clearing, obscuring its vision. Using the last of his strength, the wizard slipped into the forest, leaving the clearing behind as the fog thickened around him. His body ached, his mind raced, but he knew he had to keep moving. The Mothman would not give up the chase, and neither would the warlock's other minions. In the darkness of the forest, with the sound of the swarm still buzzing faintly behind him, the wizard fled into the night, knowing that the warlock's grip on Boren was tightening. But he also knew that as long as he still drew breath, there was hope. He would find a way to stop the warlock's evil, no matter the cost. But as the night grew colder and the shadows deepened, even the wizard had to admit, his time was running out. Darkness Falls, Part 18. Dr. Wolf had always enjoyed the quiet of his London study. Nestled within the old brick walls of his townhouse, the room was a sanctuary of knowledge and intellect. Shelves of leather-bound books lined the walls, their pages filled with years of medical research and discoveries. On his heavy oak desk, papers were neatly stacked, and an oil lamp flickered gently, casting a warm glow across the room. It was late, well past midnight, and the city outside was still. The only sounds that reached Dr. Wolf were the faint crackling of the fire in the hearth and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. He had fallen asleep in his armchair, a book on rare diseases resting in his lap, his mind drifting between the lines of research and slumber. But something pulled him from his sleep. A sensation. A shift in the air. At first, it was subtle, a faint chill that seemed to creep through the room, unsettling the once warm atmosphere. Dr. Wolf stirred, his eyes slowly opening as he glanced toward the window. The street beyond was dark, as expected, but inside his study, something was different. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath. He rose from his chair, setting the book aside and adjusting his glasses. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as an odd purple glow began to fill the room, emanating from the corners like mist seeping in from another world. It was a deep, otherworldly hue, swirling in the air like a living thing, moving with purpose. What in the devil? Dr. Wolf muttered to himself, his sharp mind racing to make sense of what was happening. But before he could act, before he could even process the strangeness of it all, the mist thickened, encircling him, pressing in closer. He tried to step forward, but his legs felt sluggish, as though the mist had weight to it, as though it was holding him in place. His heart began to race as he reached for something, anything, to ground himself in reality. But there was no time. The mist, now fully enveloping him, seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, glowing brighter as it twisted and churned. Suddenly, the floor beneath him trembled. Dr. Wolf looked down, his eyes widening in horror as a fiery crack snaked its way across the wooden boards. The heat from the crack was intense, and within moments, the floor split wide open, revealing a swirling vortex of fire and shadow. The flames licked at the edges of the room, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls, and at the center of the fiery portal was a void, a chasm of darkness that seemed to beckon him. The purple mist swirled around him, pulling him closer to the edge of the portal. Dr. Wolf stumbled, his hands gripping the edge of the desk in a desperate attempt to resist the pull. But the force was too strong, and the mist, now alive with dark intent, dragged him toward the fiery abyss. "No!" Dr. Wolf shouted, his voice echoing in the room as he struggled to pull himself free. But it was no use. The mist tightened its grip, and with one final, forceful tug, it pulled him into the portal. The flames roared around him as he fell, the heat searing his skin and the darkness closing in from all sides. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening, but the only thing he knew for certain was that he was no longer in his study. He was being pulled somewhere far darker, far more dangerous. And as the fiery portal consumed him, Dr. Wolf's last thought was of the growing darkness in Boren, and how, somehow, it had reached across the world to claim him. The chapter ended with Dr. Wolf falling through the portal, disappearing into the fiery depths below, his fate unknown. Darkness Falls, Part 19. Dr. Wolf tumbled through the fiery abyss, his mind a blur of chaos and confusion. The flames licked at his body, yet they did not burn him. Instead, they seemed to wrap around him, holding him in a twisted embrace as he fell deeper into the darkness. The swirling purple mist that had dragged him into the portal was gone, replaced by an oppressive void, a void that felt infinite, timeless, and devoid of hope. Time itself began to warp as he descended. Minutes stretched into hours, and then into years, yet no change occurred around him. Dr. Wolf felt his body floating, suspended in a place where the concept of time lost all meaning. There was no ground beneath him, no sky above, only the unending, suffocating blackness. And in that darkness, a deep, throbbing hatred began to grow. He wasn't sure when it started, whether it was in the 1st century or the 100th, but as the endless void stretched on, his mind began to twist and distort. Memories of his life in London, his work, his quiet evenings in the study, all of it seemed distant now, as if it belonged to another man entirely. Instead, one thought began to consume him, overpowering all else. Boren. The wizard had brought him to that cursed village so long ago, insisting it held some mystical significance, that it would challenge Dr. Wolf's mind and give him new purpose. At first, it had been an adventure, a way to escape the monotony of his medical practice. But now, in the endless void of this hellish place, Dr. Wolf saw the truth. The wizard had known all along. He had led Dr. Wolf down this path, toward the warlock's grasp. If it hadn't been for the wizard, none of this would have happened. The warlock would never have found him, never have opened that portal, and Dr. Wolf wouldn't be here, trapped in an eternity of suffering and transformation. Centuries passed, though they felt like mere minutes. Entire worlds seemed to flicker in and out of existence before Dr. Wolf's eyes, entire civilizations crumbling into ash before they were ever truly built. Time bent and folded on itself, and through it all, Dr. Wolf was forced to endure. The torment wasn't physical, it was deeper, more primal. His soul was stretched, warped, and broken over and over again. The flames, once merely a backdrop to his descent, began to seep into his very being, consuming what was left of the man he had once been. He felt his body changing, his bones twisting, his muscles tightening and expanding as the darkness remade him. His once pristine skin blackened and hardened, taking on the texture of charred stone. His hands lengthened into monstrous claws, his nails sharp as daggers, his once human features now a grotesque mask of anger and vengeance. His eyes, once filled with intellect and curiosity, burned with the fire of hell itself, glowing a fierce red, like embers smoldering deep within a furnace. His transformation was not just physical, it was spiritual. His very essence, the core of his being, had been twisted beyond recognition. He was no longer Dr. Wolf, the learned man of science and reason. He had become something else, something primal, something driven by hatred and revenge. He had become Hellhound. His mind, once sharp and analytical, now burned with a singular, overwhelming purpose: to destroy the wizard, to burn Boren to the ground. Every century that passed only deepened his fury, his hatred swelling until it was all he knew. The wizard had betrayed him, delivering him into the warlock's hands like a lamb to the slaughter. And now, in the endless torment of hell, the betrayal had festered and grown into an insatiable thirst for vengeance. He could feel the power coursing through him, the flames of hell infusing his very soul with dark, terrible strength. He had been remade, forged in the fires of eternity, and with that power came a terrible clarity. He could see it now, his role in the warlock's plans. The warlock had sent him here to break him, to mold him into the perfect weapon. And it had worked. Hellhound's mind filled with visions of Boren in flames, the wizard cowering before him, powerless to stop the onslaught. He could see the villagers running, their screams echoing in his ears as the fire consumed them. He could see the wizard's face, twisted in horror as he realized what he had unleashed. But as Hellhound's hate burned brighter with each passing century, a voice called to him through the void. It was the warlock, his words like venom in Hellhound's ears. "Rise, Hellhound," the warlock whispered, his voice echoing through the darkness. "Your time has come. Return to the land of the living and bring my vengeance with you. Let your hatred burn the world, and let the wizard feel the wrath of hell." With a savage growl, Hellhound's eyes flared red, and the portal opened once more beneath him. This time, it was not a descent into hell, it was a return to the world above. The flames roared around him, consuming him as he was pulled upward, back toward Boren, back toward the village that had become the focus of his eternal hatred. As he surged through the portal, his mind was consumed with one final, burning thought. The wizard would pay. Boren would burn. And Hellhound would be the one to deliver that destruction. Darkness Falls, Part 20. Suddenly, from the distance, there was the sound of hurried footsteps approaching. The wizard's eyes snapped up, his senses sharpening as he prepared for yet another ambush. But as the figure burst through the trees, the wizard's tension eased, recognizing the broad frame and unmistakable features of an old friend, the Highlander. The Highlander! The wizard gasped, surprised by his sudden appearance. His old friend, winded but resolute, skidded to a stop before him, his weathered face etched with concern. The Highlander, a seasoned warrior from the distant hills, had always been a trusted ally, but the urgency in his eyes now told of trouble brewing beyond the forests. "Trouble stirs in the waters, wizard," the Highlander said, his thick accent carrying the weight of dread. "I came as fast as I could. There's something out there, something I haven't felt in many, many years." The wizard frowned. What happened? The Highlander caught his breath, his hands resting on his knees as he steadied himself. "I was out on the loch, as I've always been, when the waters turned black, the sky darkened, and something came for me. Something ancient. I feared it was my end." His eyes darkened with the memory, and his mind drifted back to the terrifying events of just days before. It had been a calm morning on the loch, the waters smooth as glass beneath the Highlander's boat. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and wet earth hanging in the air, and he had been content, lost in the tranquility of the open waters. His boat, a sturdy vessel that had weathered many storms, glided effortlessly over the still surface, and for a time everything seemed right. But then, out of nowhere, the wind shifted. The Highlander had sensed it immediately, the change in the air, the way the wind carried with it a biting cold that cut through even his thick woolen cloak. He looked up, squinting at the sky, and saw dark clouds rolling in fast, far too fast for a natural storm. The once calm waters began to ripple, small waves lapping against the side of his boat. A deep, unsettling feeling took root in his gut. "I've seen storms in these waters, many a time," the Highlander recalled aloud, his voice soft as the memory replayed. But this was no ordinary storm. The sky grew darker, the water churning violently beneath the boat. The Highlander grabbed the oars, trying to navigate his way back to shore, but the lock seemed to resist him, the currents dragging him further into the deep. His arms strained as he fought against the waves, the boat lurching beneath him, and just when he thought he might still have a chance of making it back to shore, he saw it. Rising from the depths, something massive shifted beneath the surface, a shadow far too large to be any fish or creature known to man. The water bulged as if the lock itself were swelling, and for a moment, the Highlander froze, his breath catching in his throat. And then it surfaced. The water exploded upward, a massive head breaching the surface, followed by the long, sinuous neck of the Loch Ness monster. Its dark, gleaming eyes fixed on the Highlander's tiny boat, and for the first time in years, the warrior felt fear grip his heart. The creature's sheer size was staggering, its ancient form cutting through the water with a terrifying grace. Its scales shimmered with a dark sheen, glistening in the unnatural light of the storm. The Highlander, now fully aware of the danger, gripped the oars with white-knuckled hands, his instincts screaming at him to flee, but the waters fought him, keeping him trapped in the beast's domain. "I thought I was done for," the Highlander admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "It circled me, sizing me up like prey. The waves it created almost capsized the boat." The monster dipped back beneath the surface, and for a brief moment, all was quiet again. But the Highlander knew better than to trust the silence. He leaned forward, his pulse racing, and just as he expected, the creature struck again. The boat heaved violently as the monster surged upward, its massive body crashing against the hull. The Highlander was thrown backward, hitting the deck hard, his breath knocked from his lungs. Water poured over the sides of the boat as it lurched dangerously, threatening to tip. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing the oars once more, but the monster was relentless. With a roar, it surfaced again, its jaws snapping perilously close to the boat. The Highlander lashed out with the oars, striking the creature's snout, but the blow only seemed to enrage it further. The lock churned, the wind howling as the monster thrashed, and the Highlander knew he was running out of time. But just when he thought the creature would sink him and drag him to the depths, something in the distance seemed to call it back. The Highlander couldn't explain it, but the monster, as if hearing a distant summons, turned abruptly and disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only the violent ripples of its passage behind. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, and the water, once again, grew still. The Highlander, breathless and drenched, stared out across the loch, his heart pounding. The monster was gone, but the encounter had left him shaken, his mind filled with questions and fears about what had summoned such a creature, and what it meant for the land he called home. The wizard listened intently as the Highlander finished recounting his near-death encounter. He could see the weight of the experience in his friend's eyes, the way it had shaken him to his core. But the wizard also knew this was no isolated event. The warlock's dark influence was spreading, stirring ancient forces, calling them from their long slumber. "The waters are waking," the Highlander said, his voice grim. "If the Loch Ness monster is rising, there's no telling what else will follow. I came to warn ye, wizard, Boren isn't the only place in danger. Whatever the warlock's planning, it's bigger than we thought." The wizard nodded, his mind racing with the implications of what the Highlander had shared. Ancient forces were moving, forces that had no allegiance to either side, forces that could spell disaster for both Boren and the rest of the world if left unchecked. "Thank you for coming, my friend," the wizard said, placing a hand on the Highlander's shoulder. "We'll need all the strength we can muster if we're to face what's coming." The Highlander nodded in agreement, his eyes dark with the weight of what he had seen. The warlock's plans were more sinister and far-reaching than they had imagined, and now, even the waters themselves had turned against them. As they prepared to move forward, the winds began to shift again, and in the distance, the wizard could sense the growing storm, a storm far greater than any of them had anticipated. Darkness Falls, Part 21. In the depths of his dark lair, the warlock stood before his twisted altar, seething with rage. The air crackled with malevolent energy, and the purple mist that had once swirled so elegantly around him now flickered wildly, mirroring the fury boiling within. He slammed his fists onto the ancient stone, the force of the blow sending cracks spidering across its surface. How can this be? The warlock snarled, his voice echoing through the chamber, reverberating with the weight of his anger. I have summoned monsters, twisted the minds of Boren's defenders, and spread my darkness across every corner of that wretched town, yet still, they resist. The swirling images within his scrying pool reflected the reality of his frustration. The hero had been transformed into the villain, the marksman into the mercenary, and countless other creatures, like the Mothman, the Dollmaker, and the Loch Ness Monster, had been unleashed upon the villagers. And yet, despite all his efforts, Boren remained standing, its people still clinging to hope. Hope that he had not yet extinguished. With a growl, the warlock swept his hand across the pool, scattering the images in a burst of purple light. This ends now, he muttered, his eyes narrowing as he turned his gaze to an ancient tome that lay open on a nearby pedestal. The pages were filled with symbols written in blood, inscriptions that described something older than time itself, something more dangerous and destructive than anything he had unleashed before. The Nephilim. The warlock had never dared to call upon such a force before, for even he knew that the consequences could be catastrophic. The Nephilim were beings from a time before history, ancient giants born of darkness and chaos. They were said to be capable of tearing apart the very fabric of reality, consuming entire civilizations in their wake. It was said that no force, no magic, not even the power of the wizard, could hope to stand against them. But the warlock was beyond caring. If Boren refused to kneel, if the wizard continued to defy him, then he would summon an evil so great, so devastating, that nothing could withstand it. He began to chant, his voice low and guttural, as he drew symbols in the air with his fingers. The room grew colder, the shadows deepening as the ancient words filled the air, vibrating with an eerie power. The ground trembled, and a low rumble filled the chamber as the ritual reached its peak. The warlock's eyes glowed with a blinding purple light, and with a final, deafening roar, he slammed his hands onto the altar, pouring every ounce of his magic into the spell. The air itself seemed to split open, and from the crack emerged a hand, massive, clawed, and covered in thick, obsidian scales. The ground shook violently as the rest of the creature emerged, its form towering over even the warlock, its eyes burning with an unholy fire. The Nephilim, a creature of ancient evil, stood before him, its breath rattling like the echoes of 1,000 dying souls. Go, the warlock commanded, his voice trembling with both power and fear. Go to Boren and devour them. Leave nothing but ashes in your wake. The Nephilim didn't respond. It simply turned and began to walk, each step shaking the earth, leaving cracks and scorched earth in its wake. It moved with a terrifying purpose, its eyes fixed on the distant glow of the village, the scent of fear drawing it onward. The people of Boren, still reeling from the attacks of the warlock's minions, barely had time to react when the ground beneath them began to tremble. At first, they thought it was another earthquake, a side effect of the warlock's growing power, but then they saw it, the hulking silhouette of the Nephilim, towering above the tallest buildings, its massive body blotting out the moon as it drew closer. Panic spread like wildfire. Families grabbed their children, fleeing through the streets as the Nephilim's shadow swallowed them whole. The creature moved slowly, deliberately, savoring the terror that filled the air. With one massive claw, it reached down and scooped up an entire group of villagers, lifting them high into the air. Their screams filled the night, desperate cries for mercy as they were brought closer to the creature's gaping maw. The Nephilim's jaws opened wide, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. With a sickening crunch, it devoured the villagers, their screams cutting off abruptly as they disappeared into the darkness. The cries of the villagers grew more frantic as they fled through the streets, their terror palpable as the Nephilim continued its slow, relentless advance. Houses were crushed underfoot, and with each step, the ground split open, swallowing entire families into the abyss. Please, someone help us. A woman screamed, clutching her child to her chest as she ran, her eyes wide with fear. "Where is the wizard?" But the wizard, still licking his wounds deep in the forest, had not yet arrived. He was unaware of the terror that had descended upon his beloved village, unaware that the warlock had unleashed a creature born from the very depths of hell itself. The Nephilim let out a deafening roar, the sound reverberating through the night, shaking the very foundations of Boren. Its eyes glowed brighter, and it moved faster now, feeding off the fear and chaos that surrounded it. More villagers were scooped up, their screams echoing through the air as they disappeared into the creature's mouth, one by one. And still, the wizard did not come. From his dark chamber, the warlock watched the destruction with a twisted smile, his eyes glowing with triumph as the screams of Boren's people echoed through the air. "Yes," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Yes, let the world see. Let them know that there is no hope. Not against me." And as the chapter ended, the Nephilim continued its relentless advance, its hunger insatiable, its purpose clear. The warlock's greatest weapon had been unleashed, and Boren, once a place of light and hope, had become a place of nightmares, its people devoured by a creature older than time itself. The wizard's absence was felt in every corner, his name called out by those who had once trusted in his power, but he was nowhere to be found. And in that moment, it seemed as though the warlock's victory was all but assured, as the darkness closed in and the Nephilim fed, one soul at a time. Darkness Falls, Part 22. In the vast, moonlit stretches of the desert, where the wind whispered tales of long-forgotten horrors, something ancient stirred. The sands shifted restlessly, moving like waves over the dunes, and the night air grew thick with a sense of unease. For years, the creature known as Chupacabra had lain dormant, buried beneath the shifting sands, its thirst for blood subdued by the passing of time. It had roamed the desert nights in ages past, leaving a trail of lifeless, blood-drained animals in its wake, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it had vanished, fading into legend. But the warlock's darkness had spread far and wide, touching even the most remote and forsaken corners of the world. And as that malevolent influence seeped into the desert, it reached the ancient resting place of the Chupacabra, rousing it from its long slumber. The creature felt the pulse of the warlock's power like a heartbeat in the earth, a call that reverberated through the sands, awakening the hunger that had lain dormant for so many years. The Chupacabra's eyes flickered open, glowing a vivid, sickly green in the darkness. Its limbs twitched, claws scraping against the hard-packed earth as it rose from its shallow grave, sand cascading off its scaly body. It sniffed the air, and the scent of fear and blood filled its nostrils, an intoxicating aroma that stirred memories of ancient hunts, of nights spent stalking prey beneath the pale moonlight. The creature emerged from the sand, shaking itself free, its form hunched and twisted, covered in patches of rough skin. Its fangs, sharp as knives, glistened in the moonlight, and its tongue flicked out, tasting the air. Hunger gnawed at its belly, a hunger that had been silenced for far too long. The warlock's influence had not just awakened the Chupacabra, it had sharpened its thirst, amplifying the creature's natural bloodlust until it became an all-consuming need. It began to move, slinking across the desert with a terrifying grace, its body low to the ground, leaving shallow tracks in the sand. Every step carried it closer to the scent that had drawn it from its rest, the scent of blood. The night was still, save for the sound of its claws scratching against the rocks and the soft hiss of sand sliding beneath its feet. It moved with purpose, driven by a primal instinct that had long been denied. As the Chupacabra crested a sand dune, it paused, its glowing eyes narrowing as it scanned the horizon. In the distance, a small ranch stood isolated beneath the moonlight, its weathered wooden walls and corral bathed in an eerie glow. Livestock huddled together in the pen, restless and uneasy, sensing the predator that watched them from the darkness. It was a sight the Chupacabra knew well, a reminder of the countless nights it had spent prowling the desert, hunting under the cover of darkness. With a low growl rumbling from deep within its chest, the creature began its approach, moving silently across the sand, its eyes locked on the unsuspecting animals. It had been so long since it had tasted blood, and the hunger that gnawed at its belly was nearly unbearable. The warlock's magic thrummed through its veins, urging it forward, whispering promises of power and unending feasts. It reached the edge of the corral, its long claws curling around the wooden beams, and paused, savoring the moment. The livestock, sensing the danger, began to stir, their frightened bleats filling the air. But it was too late. The Chupacabra lunged forward, its jaws snapping shut around the neck of the nearest goat, blood spraying across the sand as it fed with a savage, unrestrained hunger. The warmth of the blood filled its mouth, and it drank deeply, feeling strength and power course through its body with every drop. One by one, the animals fell, their bodies drained of life as the chupacabra moved through the corral, leaving nothing but lifeless husks in its wake. The moon hung high in the sky, watching silently as the creature gorged itself, its hunger finally sated after centuries of denial. But even as it fed, even as the blood ran down its chin and stained the sand beneath its feet, the whispers of the warlock's magic continued to pulse in its mind, urging it onward. More, the darkness seemed to say. There is more to be taken. The chupacabra lifted its head, blood dripping from its fangs, and turned its gaze toward the horizon. It could feel the warlock's power calling to it, drawing it toward Boren, where the scent of fear and blood was strongest. The villagers would never see it coming, never suspect that something so ancient, so terrible, had been awakened by the darkness that now spread across the land. With one last glance at the slaughtered animals, the chupacabra began to move, its limbs tense and coiled with energy, its hunger renewed by the taste of blood. It slipped into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the mangled remains of its prey behind. The warlock's influence had once again claimed another servant, and as the chupacabra moved toward Boren, the darkness that surrounded the village grew ever deeper, ever more dangerous. And in the dead of night, as the moonlight cast long shadows across the desert, one thing was certain: the chupacabra had returned, and its thirst would not be quenched until every drop of blood had been spilled. Darkness Falls, Part 23. The tale of the warlock and the crusader began long before Boren's descent into darkness, long before the warlock's evil had spread its corrupting tendrils across the land. They were brothers once, inseparable in their youth, bound by blood and loyalty. Their shared destiny seemed unshakable, two sons of a noble house raised to bring honor to their family name. But fate, it seemed, had different plans. In those early days, they were simply two young men, eager to prove themselves in a world that demanded strength and courage. The elder brother, who would one day be known as the Crusader, was the light of their family, a shining example of righteousness and valor. His skills in battle were unmatched, and he was guided by a strong sense of justice. His younger brother, the one who would become the warlock, had been different. Quiet, introspective, drawn to the mysteries of magic and the hidden forces that govern the world. Where the Crusader sought glory on the battlefield, the warlock sought knowledge in the ancient tomes of forgotten realms. But even as children, there had always been a tension between them. The Crusader's path toward the light had taken him further and further from the shadows where his brother had found solace. The more the Crusader embraced the light, the more the warlock turned toward the darkness, feeling the weight of his brother's absence grow heavier with each passing day. They had once shared everything. Now, it was as though a chasm had formed between them, one that widened as the years went on, until one day, it was too vast to cross. The breaking point came when the Crusader, after receiving a vision from a higher power, left their home behind to join the forces of light in a holy war. He had made his choice to serve the greater good, to bring justice to the world. And in doing so, he had abandoned his brother. The warlock, left behind in a world that seemed to offer him nothing, felt the sting of that abandonment in the deepest corners of his heart. Alone and betrayed, he sought solace in the dark arts, turning to magic more powerful and more dangerous than any he had dabbled in before. He immersed himself in ancient rituals, forging alliances with powers that fed on his anger, his bitterness, and his longing for revenge. His brother's departure had not just left him alone, it had left him hollow, and the warlock filled that void with rage. The Crusader had chosen the light and left him to rot in the darkness. The bond they had shared as brothers was now broken, shattered by betrayal. Years passed, and the brothers followed their separate paths, one toward the light, the other toward the dark. But their fates were intertwined, and it was only a matter of time before they would meet again. And when they did, it would not be as brothers, but as enemies. The night was thick with tension as the Crusader stood in the ruins of what had once been a peaceful village, now reduced to ash and rubble by the warlock's hand. His armor gleamed in the moonlight, his sword, an ancient blade blessed by the light, held firmly in his grip. His face, once filled with the hope and light of his cause, was now lined with the weight of what lay before him. His brother had become a monster. The warlock appeared from the shadows, his figure cloaked in dark robes, his eyes burning with the purple fire of his magic. The very air around him seemed to twist with malevolent energy, the ground cracking beneath his feet as he approached. "Brother," the warlock hissed, his voice filled with venom. "How long has it been? How many years since you left me behind to bask in your glory?" The Crusader's jaw tightened, his knuckles white on the hilt of his sword. "I did what I had to do. I chose a path to save the world. And left me to rot," the warlock snarled, his eyes narrowing. "You abandoned me, Crusader. You chose the light and left me with nothing." "I never wanted this," the Crusader said, his voice soft but firm. "I never wanted us to be enemies." "Then you should never have left," the warlock spat, his fingers curling as purple magic crackled between them. "But it's too late now, isn't it? You've made your choice. And I've made mine." The Crusader's heart ached with the memories of their youth, of the brother he had once loved. But those days were long gone, and the man who stood before him now was no longer the brother he remembered. He was a force of darkness, a threat to everything the Crusader had sworn to protect. "I will stop you, brother," the Crusader said, raising his sword. "I will stop you, even if it means I have to kill you." The warlock sneered, his eyes glowing brighter. "You can try." With a flick of his wrist, the warlock unleashed a torrent of dark magic, sending it hurtling toward the Crusader. The Crusader raised his shield, deflecting the blast, and then charged forward, his sword gleaming as it cut through the air. The battle between them was fierce, each strike filled with years of anger, regret, and betrayal. Magic clashed with steel as the brothers fought, their movements fluid and deadly. The warlock's dark energy crackled through the air, but the Crusader's blade, imbued with the power of the light, cut through the darkness like a beacon. The warlock's magic lashed out again and again, but the Crusader met each attack with skill and precision. And then, in a moment of sheer force and determination, the Crusader saw his opening. He knocked aside the warlock's defenses and swung his sword, the blade aimed for his brother's heart. The warlock staggered, his breath catching as the Crusader loomed over him, victory within reach. But before the Crusader could deliver the final blow, the warlock smiled. "You think this is over?" The warlock whispered, his voice weak but filled with malice. "You think you've won?" The Crusader's eyes narrowed. "It's over, brother. Your reign of terror ends here." The warlock's smile widened. "Not yet." With a wave of his hand, the air between them shimmered, and a dark portal opened beside the warlock. From the portal emerged an image, one that made the Crusader's heart stop. It was the Valkyrie, his love, the woman who had stood by his side through every battle, every hardship. She was bound in chains, her wings clipped, her eyes filled with terror as she struggled against her restraints. The sight of her, helpless and in the warlock's grasp, sent a wave of horror through the Crusader. The Crusader's sword faltered midair, his heart pounding with dread as he saw the fear in the Valkyrie's eyes. "Brother, what have you done?" The Crusader whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the warlock's magic. The warlock, weakened but victorious, laughed bitterly. "You were always so predictable, Crusader. So noble. So blind. You may have bested me today, but you will never win. Not as long as she is mine." The Crusader took a step back, his mind racing as he struggled to comprehend the twisted reality before him. The Valkyrie, his love, his light, was in the hands of his brother. Every fiber of his being screamed to destroy the warlock then and there, but with her life at stake, he couldn't bring himself to strike. "Let her go," the Crusader demanded, his voice filled with a mix of rage and desperation. "This has nothing to do with her." The warlock's eyes glinted with malice. "Oh, but it does, brother. She's everything to you, isn't she? Your light. Your hope. The reason you left me behind. You chose her over family, over me, and now you'll have to make a choice again." The Crusader's hands trembled as he gripped his sword, torn between his duty to stop the warlock and his love for the Valkyrie. The warlock saw the hesitation and reveled in it, feeding off his brother's torment. "Kill me, and she dies," the warlock continued, his voice a twisted whisper. "Let me live, and I will release her. But only after Boren has fallen." The Crusader's eyes darted from the warlock to the Valkyrie, her face pale and her body bound in chains that glowed with dark magic. His mind spun in turmoil. He had come here to end his brother's reign of terror, to protect Boren and save the people from the darkness. But now, His heart was tearing him apart. "I will never let you win," the Crusader muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "But I cannot sacrifice her." The Warlock grinned, sensing his brother's internal struggle. "Then you will lose everything. You've already failed, Crusader. The choice is no longer yours." Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to shake violently, the Warlock's magic swirling in a chaotic storm around them. The dark portal flickered as the Warlock raised his hands, summoning more power from the ancient forces that had fueled his rise. The air thickened with an unbearable tension, and for a brief moment, the Crusader felt utterly helpless. "Only one man can stop what's coming now," the Warlock said, his voice low and sinister. "And it's not you." The Crusader's heart sank as he realized what his brother meant. The Warlock was not only after Boren, but something far greater. And the only one with the knowledge and power to stop the darkness from consuming them all was the Wizard. With a final, malicious glance at his brother, the Warlock disappeared into the swirling darkness, dragging the Valkyrie with him through the portal. The Crusader lunged forward, but it was too late. The portal closed, leaving him alone in the ruins of the battlefield. He fell to his knees, his sword clattering to the ground beside him. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of failure pressing down on him. His brother had escaped, and the Valkyrie was now a prisoner of the darkness. Boren was on the verge of destruction, and there was nothing he could do. Except one thing. The Crusader stood, his face hardening with resolve. He would seek out the Wizard, for only he could undo the Warlock's latest scheme. Only the Wizard had the power to save the Valkyrie and stop the ancient evil that now threatened to consume them all. As the Crusader turned toward the distant horizon, he felt a flicker of hope in his chest. The fight wasn't over yet, but time was running out, and Boren's fate now rested in the hands of the Wizard. Darkness falls. Finito. The sky over Boren was blackened with clouds, thick with the promise of chaos. Lightning crackled across the heavens, and the air thrummed with the combined magic of opposing forces. At the heart of the battlefield stood the Warlock, his figure cloaked in shadow and malevolent energy, his purple fire burning bright in his hands. Around him swarmed his dark army, the Mothman, the Dollmaker's twisted creations, the Nephilim towering over the battlefield, and the Chupacabra slinking through the shadows, waiting for the chance to strike. Santa Lantern lurked at the edges, grinning as the flicker of children's nightmares danced across his twisted pumpkin face. And before them, standing defiantly in the storm, were the Wizard and the Crusader, their faces grim but resolute. The Wizard's staff glowed with ancient magic, and beside him, the Crusader's sword gleamed with the light of righteousness. This was not just a fight for survival, it was a battle for the soul of Boren, a last stand against the Warlock's malevolent rule. The Warlock raised his hands, and the battlefield erupted in chaos. Shadows surged forward like a tidal wave, clashing with the brilliant light summoned by the Wizard. The Crusader charged into the fray, his sword slicing through dark creatures, each strike echoing with the power of his determination to save his brother and his village. The battle raged, magic colliding with steel, light fighting against shadow. The Crusader fought like a man possessed, cutting down the Warlock's minions with every swing of his blade, while the Wizard wove spells that kept the darkness at bay. But the Warlock's power was immense, and his army relentless. For every minion that fell, another took its place. In the heart of the storm, the Warlock and the Wizard faced each other, ancient foes locked in a deadly dance of magic. Their spells crackled and collided in the air, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The Wizard fought with all his might, but the Warlock's magic, fueled by years of hatred and bitterness, began to overwhelm him. With a flick of his hand, the Warlock sent a blast of dark energy that shattered the Wizard's defenses, sending him sprawling to the ground. The Crusader cried out and rushed to his friend's side, standing protectively between the Wizard and the advancing Warlock. "It ends here," the Warlock snarled, his voice filled with triumph. "Boren is mine, and there is nothing you can do to stop me." The Crusader raised his sword, his gaze steady despite the odds stacked against him. "If you want Boren, brother, you'll have to go through me." The Warlock sneered, his hand glowing with dark magic as he prepared to strike. But just as the spell was about to be cast, something flickered in his eyes, something the Crusader hadn't seen in years. Regret. The Warlock hesitated, his magic faltering as memories flooded his mind. Memories of their childhood, of the bond they had once shared, of the love that had existed between them before the darkness took hold. "You left me," the warlock whispered, his voice wavering for the first time. I know, the Crusader replied softly, and I've regretted it every day since. For a long moment, the two brothers stood in silence, the storm raging around them. Then, slowly, the warlock lowered his hand, the dark fire in his eyes dimming. I have spent so long feeding my hatred, the warlock murmured. But now I see. I was only ever angry because I missed you. The Crusader lowered his sword, hope flickering in his heart. It's not too late, brother. We can end this. Together. The warlock's face softened, the weight of centuries of anger and bitterness lifting from his shoulders. Together. With a wave of his hand, the warlock banished his minions. The Mothman screeched in frustration as he was dragged back into the shadows. The Dollmaker's creations crumbled to dust, and the Nephilim was swallowed by the ground. The Chupacabra hissed one last time before slinking away into the desert night. Santolantern's sinister grin flickered and vanished as he melted back into the fog, returning to where he belonged. The battlefield grew quiet as the storm dissipated, leaving only the brothers and the wizard standing amidst the ruins. For the first time in years, the warlock smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. Boren will once again be safe from my evil, the warlock said, his voice carrying a note of peace. But we are not done yet. The wizard raised an eyebrow, curious. What do you mean? The warlock's grin turned mischievous. Krampus is already on his way to the North Pole. If we don't stop him, Christmas will be ruined. Forever. The Crusader laughed, the sound light and free, as if the years of sorrow had melted away. Then it seems our work is not yet finished. The wizard nodded, a flicker of amusement dancing in his tired eyes. We'll need all the help we can get. The warlock stepped forward, clapping a hand on his brother's shoulder. Together, then. Together, the Crusader agreed. With a flick of his hand, the warlock summoned a swirling portal, its edges crackling with energy. Snowflakes drifted through the vortex, and a distant jingle of bells echoed from the other side. Let's go save Christmas, the warlock said with a grin. And with that, the brothers, along with the wizard, stepped through the portal, leaving behind the ruins of Boren and venturing toward the North Pole, ready to face whatever awaited them on the other side. Because some battles are fought for survival, and some are fought to save Christmas. Darkness falls. Epilogue. Epilogue. A new dawn for Boren with the warlock's curse lifted and the battle for Boren won. Peace began to take root in the hearts of the villagers. Against all odds, the bonds of brotherhood had triumphed over darkness, and the Valkyrie, once a prisoner of the warlock's malice, was freed. She now stood side by side with the Crusader, their love unshaken, ready to help rebuild what had been lost. The heroes who had fallen under the warlock's influence, the hero turned villain, the marksman twisted into the mercenary, and others who had been tainted, were granted rest. Though the battle had ended, they required time to recover from the shadows that had clouded their hearts. As promised, after 1 week of rest and reprieve, they would return to their original selves, free from the chains of darkness that had bound them. In the aftermath of the battle, Boren began to rise from its ruins. The villagers, now united in purpose, worked tirelessly to rebuild their homes and lives. The warlock, once the source of their suffering, lent his power to aid the reconstruction, summoning timber and stone from distant places and filling the village coffers. His magic, once feared and despised, was now used for creation rather than destruction, a gift of redemption, freely offered. Though some villagers eyed him with lingering wariness, others began to see that even the most wicked heart could be mended. The Crusader stood beside his brother every step of the way, proving that love and forgiveness could conquer even the deepest of wounds. However, the work was far from over. Boren had been saved, but far beyond the borders of the village, new dangers stirred. In the distant, snow-covered reaches of the North Pole, Krampus remained at large, his sinister plans still unfolding in the shadows. Though the warlock had helped defeat his minions in Boren, Krampus's wickedness demanded justice. There is much work yet to be done, the warlock said, standing atop the ruins of what had once been his lair, his gaze fixed toward the distant, frozen horizon. Krampus is out there, and his evil won't rest until he's brought to justice. The Crusader nodded, his sword sheathed at his side, ready for whatever came next. We'll find him, he said with unwavering determination. And we'll end this. Together. The wizard, standing beside them, adjusted his robes and gave a small, knowing smile. It seems our next adventure awaits. The journey to the North Pole will not be easy. The brothers exchanged a glance, one filled not with anger, but with hope. Their battles may have forged scars, but those scars were now reminders of the bond they had reclaimed. And now, united with the wizard by their side, they were ready for whatever awaited them. Together, they would embark on a new quest. Krampus would not escape justice, and the light would once again shine across the land. And so, the adventurers prepared for their next journey, an expedition into the unknown, where the icy winds howled and danger lurked in every shadow. The fight for Boren was over, but their story was far from finished. With their hearts resolute and their purpose clear, they set their sights on the distant horizon, ready to bring an end to Krampus's reign before it was too late. For now, Boren was safe. But new challenges awaited, and the next chapter of their tale had already begun. And so, the villagers of Boren watched their heroes depart, knowing that peace had come at last, but also understanding that some battles must be fought far from home, in lands where shadows still lurked, and ancient evils waited to rise again. The story of Boren may have ended, but the story of justice was just beginning.